This video is about the history of Canada. This is a very important video for the Canadian citizenship test. Please subscribe the channel. Before 1867, Canada was inhabited by Indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for thousands of years. In the late 15th century, European explorers, including John Cabot, arrived on Canada's shores. In the 16th and 17th centuries, French and British colonies were established in what is now Canada. In the mid-18th century, the British gained control of what is now Canada through the Treaty of Paris. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the British and the French fought for control of Canada, culminating in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, which led to British control of Quebec. The War of 1812 for Canada. The War of 1812 began in June 1812, when the United States declared war on Great Britain. The main causes of the war included disputes over trade and maritime rights, as well as British support for Indigenous resistance to American expansion. Canada was a British colony at the time, and was seen by the United States as a vulnerable target for invasion. American forces launched several attacks on Canadian territory, including the capture of Fort Mackinac and the invasion of Upper Canada, now Ontario. Canadian forces, led by British officers, fought back against the American invaders. One of the most famous battles of the war was the Battle of Queenstown Heights, in which Canadian and British forces defeated an American invasion force. The war also involved Indigenous peoples, who were caught up in the conflict as both sides sought to enlist their support. Some Indigenous groups allied with the British, while others sided with the Americans. The war ended in 1814 with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which restored the pre-war borders between the United States and British North America, now Canada. The treaty did not address the main issues that had led to the war, but it did establish a basis for improved relations between the United States and Britain in the years to come. The Rebellion of 1837–38 was a political uprising that took place in Upper and Lower Canada, now Ontario and Quebec, against the British colonial government. The rebellion was sparked by a combination of factors, including political unrest, economic hardship, and frustration with the British colonial government's policies and practices. In Upper Canada, the rebellion was led by William Lyon Mackenzie, a newspaper publisher and political activist who advocated for democratic reform and greater autonomy for the colony. In Lower Canada, the rebellion was led by Louis Joseph Papineau, a lawyer and politician who opposed the British colonial government's efforts to impose a more centralized and authoritarian form of government on the colony. The rebellions were largely unsuccessful, as British troops and loyalist militias were able to suppress the uprisings and arrest many of the rebel leaders. The aftermath of the rebellion saw a wave of political repression and increased British control over the colonies. However, it also led to increased demands for democratic reform and greater autonomy, which would eventually be realized through a series of constitutional changes and political struggles in the years to come. The Rebellion of 1837–38 is seen as an important event in Canadian history, as it marked a turning point in the country's development towards greater political autonomy and self-determination. World War I. Canada entered World War I in 1914 as part of the British Empire, with the Canadian Expeditionary Force, CEF, being sent to Europe to fight on the Western Front. Over the course of the war, more than 600,000 Canadians served in the armed forces, with more than 66,000 losing their lives and 170,000 being wounded. Canada's most famous battle of the war was the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917, where the CEF captured a strategically important ridge that had eluded both British and French forces. Canada also played a role in the final year of the war, helping to push the German army back and ultimately contributing to the Allied victory in 1918. The Second World War was a global conflict that lasted from 1939 to 1945. Canada entered the war on September 10, 1939, after Britain declared war on Germany. As a member of the British Empire, Canada was committed to supporting Britain and its allies in the fight against Nazi Germany and its allies. Over the course of the war, Canada mobilized more than 1 million men and women for military service, including soldiers, sailors, and pilots. Canadian forces served in many different theaters of the war, including Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Canadian soldiers fought in some of the most significant battles of the war, including the Battle of the Atlantic, the Dieppe Raid, the Italian Campaign, and the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Canadian pilots also played a crucial role in the Battle of Britain, and Canadian sailors were instrumental in protecting Allied convoys from German U-boat attacks. Canada suffered significant losses during the war, both in terms of soldiers and civilians. More than 45,000 Canadian soldiers were killed, and many more were wounded or taken prisoner. Canadian civilians also suffered from the impact of the war, including rationing, shortages, and the internment of Japanese Canadians. Despite the losses, Canada emerged from the war as a major player on the world stage. The country's contributions to the Allied war effort, along with its economic and industrial development during the war, helped to establish Canada as a significant player in international affairs. The war also had a significant impact on Canadian society and politics. The sacrifices made during the war helped to forge a sense of national unity and identity, and contributed to the growing demands for greater social and political equality in the post-war years. In terms of territorial gains and losses, Canada did not experience any major changes to its borders during the war. However, Canadian soldiers played a crucial role in liberating parts of Europe from Nazi control, and Canada was one of the founding members of the United Nations, which was established in 1945 to promote international peace and security. After the Second World War, Canada underwent significant political, economic, and social changes. Here are some key points about Canada's history after the war. Politically, the post-war years saw the rise of a more liberal and interventionist government, as the country sought to address the social and economic challenges of the post-war period. In 1948, the government introduced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set out a framework for protecting the rights and freedoms of individuals around the world. Economically, Canada experienced a period of rapid growth and expansion, as the country's industrial base and natural resources helped to fuel a post-war boom. The government also introduced a number of social welfare programs and policies, such as universal health care and the Canada Pension Plan, to support the well-being of Canadians. Immigration also played a significant role in shaping Canada's post-war history, as the country welcomed hundreds of thousands of immigrants from around the world. In the 1950s and 1960s, Canada adopted a more inclusive approach to immigration, ending the discriminatory White Canada policy and adopting a points-based system that prioritized skilled workers and family reunification. The post-war years also saw significant social and cultural changes in Canada, as the country embraced new forms of art, music, and popular culture. The country also saw growing movements for social justice and civil rights, particularly in relation to Indigenous peoples, women, and racial minorities. In the latter part of the 20th century, Canada also underwent significant constitutional changes, including the adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982. The Charter enshrined key human rights protections, including freedom of expression, equality before the law, and the right to a fair trial. Next video is about the history of Canada questions answers. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe the channel.